This will be set in Kansas, 1882, featuring a black rancher, his daughter and an outcast woman, with themes of innocence, family, and public redemption. I'll make it compelling with retention hooks, emotional triggers, and appropriate CTAs as requested. Some say the most powerful words ever spoken are those that escape the innocent lips of a child. In 1882, Kansas, 3 simple words from a 5-year-old girl shattered the walls of hatred that an entire town had built. What is it about the truth of children that can pierce through our darkest prejudices? This is the story of a man who built a life of dignity from the ashes of bondage, a little girl who saw with eyes unclouded by hate, and a woman whose face the town refused to see until they had no choice. Stay until the very end to witness a moment so profound, so transformative, that it changed not just 3 lives, but an entire community's understanding of what it means to be human. Before we ride deeper into this powerful story, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Why? Because here at The Black Rancher, we're uncovering the hidden stories of black heroes who helped shape the American frontier, stories deliberately buried by those who wrote our history books. If you believe everyone deserves to see themselves in America's great narrative, share this video now. These forgotten tales of courage, dignity, and love deserve to be told. Subscribe now and let's preserve this legacy together. Now let's journey back to 1882 to a small Kansas town where our story begins. Elijah Freeman rode into Cottonwood Springs before sunrise, the way he always did on the first Saturday of each month. The main street lay empty, save for a stray dog sniffing at the previous night's discarded bottles. His daughter Grace slept against his chest, wrapped in a woolen blanket against the pre-dawn chill. At 5 years old, she was his greatest joy, his most precious legacy, and the reason he made this monthly journey into a town that barely tolerated his presence. "You awake, little bird," he whispered, feeling her stir. Grace yawned and looked up, her brown eyes bright even in the dim light. "Are we there, Papa?" "Just arrived." Elijah adjusted his hat, straightening his shoulders as the first light of morning touched the storefronts. "Remember what I told you. Stay close, be polite, don't wander." She recited the rules with practiced precision, then added, "And remember, I'm a Freeman, not a—" "That's right," Elijah cut her off gently. "You're a Freeman, we both are." The name wasn't one he'd been born with. Like most who'd escaped slavery, Elijah had chosen it himself after the war, when a man with dark skin could finally claim the dignity of a surname. 17 years had passed since emancipation, yet in towns like Cottonwood Springs, freedom remained a complex concept, especially for a black man who'd managed to build something for himself. The Freeman Ranch lay 15 miles outside town, 320 acres of decent grassland, with a creek running through the eastern section. Elijah had homesteaded it 7 years ago, arriving with nothing but determination and the skills he'd developed working cattle on a Texas drive. Now he ran 60 head of cattle, kept 4 good horses, and had built a modest but sturdy 2-room cabin with his own hands. "Mr. Daniels is opening up." Grace pointed to the general store where a gray-haired man was unlocking the front door. "Then let's get our business done." Elijah helped Grace down from the horse, her small boots hitting the dirt with a soft thud. He tied his horse to the hitching post and straightened his daughter's dress, the blue one he'd saved 3 months to buy from a mail-order catalog. "Good morning, Mr. Daniels," Elijah called, his voice respectful but firm. He'd learned that particular tone during his years in bondage, courteous enough to avoid trouble, dignified enough to maintain his humanity. Harold Daniels barely looked up. "Freeman." He nodded curtly. "Got your list ready?" Elijah handed over a carefully written note. Monthly supplies were the primary reason for these trips: flour, coffee, sugar, ammunition, fabric for Grace's growing frame, and any tools he couldn't craft himself. "Add 10 pounds of nails," Elijah said, "expanding the barn before winter." Daniels raised an eyebrow, but said nothing as he began gathering the items. The storekeeper wasn't the most hostile man in Cottonwood Springs, but neither was he friendly. He took Elijah's money without complaint and provided fair measure of goods, which in 1882 Kansas was as much as a black rancher could reasonably expect. "Papa, can I look at the candy?" Grace asked, eyeing the glass jars on the counter. "Just looking," Elijah cautioned, though he had already set aside a penny for a peppermint stick, a monthly tradition. As Daniels tallied the purchases, the bell above the door jingled. Sheriff Thomas Ellis entered, his badge catching the morning light. The lawman's eyes narrowed slightly at the sight of Elijah, then shifted to Grace. "Freeman," he acknowledged, then tipped his hat to the child. "Miss Grace." "Good morning, Sheriff," the little girl replied with perfect manners that Elijah had drilled into her. In a world that would judge her harshly for her skin, Grace's comportment was another form of armor. "Heard you lost a few head to rustlers last month," the sheriff said, surprising Elijah with the acknowledgement. "3 cows," Elijah confirmed, "found tracks heading north, but they crossed onto Blackwell land, so I turned back." The sheriff's mouth tightened. "Wise decision. Old man Blackwell shoots trespassers first and sorts out reasons later." He paused. "If you filed a proper report, I could look into it." The offer hung in the air, unexpected, possibly a trap, but maybe something else. Elijah studied the lawman's face for signs of mockery, but found none. "I'd appreciate that, Sheriff." Ellis nodded. "Stop by the office before you head out." Then to Grace. "You behaving for your father, young lady?" "Yes, sir. Papa says good behavior is a reflection of good character." Something flickered across the sheriff's weathered face. Surprise, perhaps, or reluctant respect. "Your papa's right about that." He tipped his hat again and moved to the counter. As Daniels finished wrapping their purchases, the door chimed again. This time 3 women entered, members of the town's ladies' auxiliary, led by Agatha Whitcomb, the banker's wife. Their conversation died instantly at the sight of Elijah and Grace. "Mr. Daniels," Mrs. Whitcomb said loudly, ignoring Elijah entirely, "I do hope you've received those fabric samples I ordered from St. Louis." "Just arrived yesterday, Mrs. Whitcomb." Daniels gestured to a shelf behind the counter. Elijah gathered his packages efficiently, knowing when to make himself scarce. "Grace," he called softly, "time to go." But Grace had wandered toward the window, where something had caught her attention. Elijah followed her gaze to the street outside, where a slender figure hurried along the boardwalk, head down, shawl pulled tight despite the warming day. "Who is that, Papa?" Grace asked, her voice carrying in the suddenly quiet store. Elijah recognized the woman immediately, though he'd never spoken to her. Everyone in Cottonwood Springs knew of Martha Collins, but few acknowledged her existence, at least not in polite company. "Just someone going about their business, little bird," he answered, taking her hand, "like we should be doing." But Grace continued to watch the woman through the window, her face alight with a child's curiosity. "Her dress is patched like mine," she observed, "but she walks like she's trying to disappear." From behind them came Mrs. Whitcomb's sharp intake of breath, followed by a whispered, "Really, Mr. Daniels, I don't understand why you allow certain elements to shop during respectable hours." Elijah tightened his grip on Grace's hand, eager to be gone before the situation deteriorated. But as they stepped onto the boardwalk, they found themselves directly in the path of Martha Collins, who'd stopped to adjust a package she carried. The woman looked up, startled. Her face, Elijah noticed, might once have been pretty, before life and circumstances had etched lines of worry around her mouth and eyes. A faint scar ran along her left cheekbone, a remnant of whatever troubled past had brought her to this place. "Excuse us, ma'am," Elijah said politely, preparing to step around her. But Grace, with a child's perfect timing and terrible judgment, chose that moment to speak. "Papa," she said, her voice clear as a bell in the morning air, pointing directly at Martha Collins. "She's beautiful." Martha Collins froze at the child's words, her pale blue eyes wide with shock. For 7 years she'd walked Cottonwood Springs streets as if invisible, enduring whispers and turned backs. And now this child, this little black girl with bright eyes and a blue dress, had seen her, truly seen her, and named her beautiful. The street fell silent. 3 cowboys outside the saloon stopped their conversation mid-sentence. Mrs. Whitcomb and her companions stood motionless in the doorway of Daniel's store. Even the sheriff who'd followed Elijah out seemed caught by surprise. Martha's hand drifted unconsciously to the scar on her face, a permanent reminder of the night she'd fled her husband's fists in Missouri, traveling west with nothing but a carpetbag and the desperate hope of disappearing somewhere no one knew her name or her shame. "I'm sorry, Ma'am," Elijah said quickly, mortified by his daughter's breach of etiquette. In Cottonwood Springs, white women were not to be addressed directly by black men unless absolutely necessary, and ruined white women like Martha Collins weren't to be acknowledged at all. But Grace, unaware of the social catastrophe she'd created, continued to gaze at Martha with undisguised admiration. "Your hair is like sunshine," she added, gesturing to the strands of blonde escaping Martha's bonnet. "Grace," Elijah said firmly, "we need to be on our way." "That's all right," Martha said softly, her voice rusty from disuse. Few in town had heard her speak in years. She knelt to Grace's level, ignoring the scandalized gasps from the ladies' auxiliary. "Thank you, little one. That's the kindest thing anyone has said to me in a very long time." Grace beamed. "My name is Grace Freeman. What's yours?" Elijah's heart pounded. This innocent interaction violated every unwritten rule of their world. A black child conversing as an equal with a white woman in broad daylight in the middle of town. "Martha," came the gentle reply. "Martha Collins." "We should get going," Elijah insisted, acutely aware of the growing tension around them. Martha stood, nodding slightly to Elijah. Her eyes held no condescension, no disgust, just a wary recognition of their shared status as outsiders. "Good day, Mr. Freeman. Miss Grace." She stepped aside, continuing down the street with her head held marginally higher than before. "Well, I never," Mrs. Whitcomb's voice cut through the silence. "Daniel, you should have a word with your daughter about appropriate behavior." Elijah turned slowly, his face carefully neutral despite the anger building inside him. "Her name is Grace, Mrs. Whitcomb, and I believe I've taught her the most appropriate behavior of all: kindness." He lifted Grace onto his horse and mounted behind her, aware that his response would likely cost him. The sheriff caught his eye with an unreadable expression, then gave a barely perceptible nod. "We'll be seeing you at my office about those rustlers, Freeman." Elijah understood the lifeline being offered, a chance to redirect attention, to frame his presence in town as legitimate business with the law. "Yes, sir. Right away." As they rode toward the sheriff's office, Grace leaned back against his chest. "Did I do something wrong, Papa?" Elijah sighed. How could he explain the complex, irrational rules of their world to a child who saw only with the pure eyes of innocence? "No, little bird. You saw someone's beauty when others couldn't. That's never wrong." He paused. "But there are people who might not understand that." "Why doesn't anyone talk to her? Is it because of her scar?" "It's complicated," Elijah answered, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people judge others for things that aren't their fault. Like how Mr. Peterson at the feed store doesn't look at you when he talks." Elijah winced at his daughter's perception. "Something like that." At the sheriff's office, Elijah filed a formal report about the rustlers, while Grace sat quietly, drawing pictures with a stubby pencil on a scrap of paper. When they finished, Sheriff Ellis walked them to the door. "Freeman," he said quietly, "that was a dangerous moment back there." "I know," Elijah adjusted his hat. "Won't happen again." "Wasn't criticizing." The sheriff glanced at Grace, then back to Elijah. "Just be careful. Town's been on edge since that banking crisis last month, people looking for someone to blame." Elijah nodded. The warning was clear and unexpectedly considerate. As they completed their errands and prepared to leave town, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. His monthly trips to Cottonwood Springs followed a careful routine designed to minimize friction. Today, that routine had been disrupted by 3 innocent words from his daughter. What he didn't realize as they rode toward home with the sun climbing high was how profoundly those words would change not just his life, but the life of a scarred woman who'd given up hope of being seen. 3 weeks passed before Martha Collins appeared at the Freeman Ranch. Elijah was mending a fence in the north pasture when he spotted her approaching on foot. The journey from town would have taken hours, and her plain brown dress was dusty from the road. Grace, who had been helping by handing him nails, saw her at the same moment. "Papa, look, it's the beautiful lady." Elijah stood, hammer in hand, watching warily as Martha drew closer. Visitors to his property were rare, and white women, visitors unheard of. "Stay behind me, Grace," he said quietly, though he sensed no threat from the approaching figure. Martha stopped a respectful distance away, clutching a small package wrapped in brown paper. Her face was flushed from exertion, her blonde hair escaping her bonnet in the summer heat. "Mr. Freeman," she called, "I apologize for the intrusion, but I'd like to speak with you, and with Grace." Elijah hesitated. Being alone on his property with a white woman, even one as ostracized as Martha Collins, was dangerous. Yet something in her demeanor, a certain desperate dignity, moved him. "You've come a long way," he replied. "Would you like some water?" Relief flickered across her face. "Yes, thank you." They walked in silence to the cabin, a simple but solid structure Elijah had expanded twice as his fortunes improved. A vegetable garden flourished nearby, and chickens scratched in a small yard. It wasn't grand by white standards, but for a man who had once been property himself, it represented a profound achievement. Grace ran ahead to fill a cup from the water barrel on the porch. Martha accepted it gratefully, drinking deeply before handing it back with a quiet "thank you." "You're welcome," Grace beamed, oblivious to the tension between the adults. "What brings you all this way, Miss Collins?" Elijah asked, remaining on his feet while Martha perched on the edge of the porch. He kept a respectable distance, aware that even on his own property, certain boundaries couldn't be crossed. "If you're still with me, you're about to witness the most powerful moment in this story, one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about courage on the American frontier. This is The Black Rancher, where we uncover the buried stories of America's past that deserve to be told. If you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. Hit that notification bell too, because you don't want to miss a single one of these powerful narratives that history books tried to erase. And if this story has touched you so far, share it with someone who appreciates authentic American history. Now let's return to 1882 Kansas, where Martha Collins has just arrived at the Freeman Ranch with an urgent message. Martha unwrapped the package she carried, revealing a small child's dress made of blue calico fabric. "I made this for Grace," she said quietly. "As thanks." Elijah stiffened. "That's not necessary, Miss Collins." "Grace didn't—" "Please," Martha interrupted, her voice suddenly intense. "You don't understand what it meant, what she did." She turned to Grace, who was watching with curious eyes. "You saw me, child. Really saw me. Do you know how long it's been since anyone looked at me as a person, not a scandal to be avoided?" Grace approached and touched the dress with reverent fingers. "It's so pretty, like the sky when it's almost dark. I was a seamstress before." Martha's hand drifted unconsciously to her scar. "I still remember how." Elijah recognized the offering for what it was, not charity, but connection, a recognition of shared humanity from one outcast to another. "It's beautiful work," he acknowledged. "Grace could wear it to school when the term starts." Martha's eyes widened. "They're allowing her to attend?" "Not in town," Elijah explained. "There's a small school at the Exodus settlement 12 miles east. Teacher there takes all children regardless of color. The Exodusters, black homesteaders who had fled the South after Reconstruction's collapse, had established a small community that served as Elijah's only real connection to others who understood his experiences." Martha nodded, then hesitated before speaking again. "There's another reason I came, Mr. Freeman. I needed to warn you." Elijah's expression grew serious. "Warn us about what?" "After what happened in town, there's been talk." "Bad talk?" She glanced at Grace. "Perhaps the child shouldn't hear this." "Grace, go check on the chickens," Elijah instructed. Once she was out of earshot, he turned back to Martha. "What kind of talk?" "Whitcomb and his crowd." Martha twisted her hands in her lap. "They're saying it's unnatural. A black man raising a child alone. suggesting maybe you can't provide proper moral guidance, especially for a girl. Elijah's face hardened. Grace is my daughter, my blood. I know that. But after she spoke to me publicly, Martha looked down. In their eyes I'm fallen, ruined, and they're using her innocent kindness toward me as evidence that you're raising her without proper understanding of social boundaries. The implicit threat hung in the air between them. In their world, authorities could separate families for far less. Why are you telling me this? Elijah asked, though he already suspected the answer. Martha met his gaze directly. Because 7 years ago I arrived in Cottonwood Springs with nothing but bruises and a freshly scarred face. No one asked questions. No one offered help. They just decided what I was. Her voice strengthened. Your daughter was the first person to see past their judgment. I won't stand by while they punish her or you for that kindness. Before Elijah could respond, hoofbeats sounded on the path to the cabin. Sheriff Ellis appeared, riding alone, his expression grim. Martha stood quickly, moving away from Elijah. Sheriff, she acknowledged, her voice suddenly formal. Ellis dismounted, eyeing them both with a complex expression, concern mingled with resignation. Miss Collins, you're a long way from town. I brought a gift for the child, she replied, to thank her for her kindness. The sheriff nodded slowly. I see. He turned to Elijah. Freeman, we need to talk. There's trouble brewing. Martha was just telling me, Elijah said, watching the sheriff carefully. Ellis removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. Then you know Whitcomb's been stirring things up. Got the town council involved now. They're talking about sending someone from the territorial authorities to evaluate your fitness as a guardian. Elijah's hands clenched into fists. On what grounds? Does it matter? Ellis asked wearily. You know how these things work. Grace returned from the chicken coop, stopping short at the sight of the sheriff. Hello, Sheriff Ellis, she said politely. Ellis's stern face softened slightly. Hello, Miss Grace. Are you here about the rustlers? She asked innocently. Papa says you've been very fair about that. Not today, child. The sheriff looked uncomfortable, glancing between the adults. Miss Collins, I should escort you back to town. It's not proper for you to be out here alone. Martha stiffened. I'm perfectly capable of finding my own way, Sheriff. I'm sure you are, but your presence here is complicating matters. Elijah understood. Whatever Ellis's personal feelings, he was still the law in Cottonwood Springs. The sheriff's right, Miss Collins. I appreciate the warning and Grace loves the dress, but you should return with him. Martha looked as if she might argue, then nodded reluctantly. Of course. She knelt to Grace's level. The dress is yours, child. So I hope you'll think of me when you wear it. Thank you, Miss Martha, Grace said, hugging the dress to her chest. Will I see you next time we come to town? An unreadable expression crossed Martha's face. Perhaps. She stood and turned to Elijah. Mr. Freeman, consider carefully what we discussed. After Martha had mounted behind the sheriff and they'd ridden away, Grace looked up at her father. Are we in trouble, Papa? Elijah lifted her onto his shoulders the way he'd done since she was tiny. No, little bird, but we may need to be extra careful for a while. Because I talked to Miss Martha, he sighed heavily. Because some people don't understand that kindness should be for everyone. That night, long after Grace was asleep, Elijah sat on his porch watching distant heat lightning illuminate the horizon. His shotgun rested across his lap, not out of immediate fear, but from the bone-deep knowledge that everything he'd built remained fragile, subject to the whims of those with power. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd fought for the Union in the final year of the war, served as a buffalo soldier on the frontier, then worked cattle drives across 3 states before saving enough to claim his own land. He'd done everything right, followed every rule, taught his daughter to be respectful and dignified. Yet a single moment of innocent humanity, a child recognizing beauty where others saw only shame, now threatened everything. As dawn approached, Elijah made his decision. He would not run. This land, this life was his by right, paid for with sweat and sacrifice. Whatever came, he would face it standing on soil that belonged to him, defending the family that gave his freedom meaning. What he couldn't know as the first light broke across his fields was that Martha Collins had made a decision of her own, one that would change the course of all their lives. The meeting of the Cottonwood Springs Town Council wasn't scheduled until 7 o'clock, but by 6 the small municipal building was already packed. Word had spread quickly. Tonight's agenda included discussion of the Freeman situation. Elijah arrived precisely on time, dressed in his finest clothes, a dark suit he'd purchased for Grace's mother's funeral 4 years earlier. Grace remained at the Exeter settlement with friends, protected from whatever might unfold. A hush fell as he entered, conversations dying mid-sentence. He removed his hat and stood tall, acknowledging the sheriff with a nod as he took a seat in the back row, the only place deemed appropriate for him. Mayor Wilson, a portly man with mutton chop whiskers, called the meeting to order with obvious discomfort. "First item on tonight's agenda is—" "We all know why we're here," interrupted Whitcomb, the banker. "Let's not waste time with formalities." He turned to face the assembled townspeople. "A grave matter of public concern has arisen regarding the welfare of a minor child residing outside our town limits." Elijah remained expressionless, though his jaw tightened. "The child in question, Grace Freeman, is being raised in inappropriate circumstances by her father, who lacks the necessary guidance to instill proper values and understanding of societal norms." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whitcomb continued, warming to his theme. "Recent events have demonstrated this deficiency when the child publicly addressed a woman of questionable character, showing a lack of proper understanding of social boundaries. "She called me beautiful," came a clear voice from the doorway. All heads turned to see Martha Collins standing at the entrance, dressed in a simple but clean grey dress, her blonde hair neatly arranged beneath a modest bonnet. She stepped into the room, ignoring the shocked whispers. "The inappropriate behavior you're so concerned about, Mr. Whitcomb, was a 5-year-old child saying I was beautiful." Her voice didn't waver. "After 7 years of being treated as invisible in this town, a little girl saw me as human. And for that you want to take her from her father." "Miss Collins," Mayor Wilson stammered, "this is a closed council meeting, to which all citizens are entitled attendance," she countered. "I've paid taxes in Cottonwood Springs for 7 years. I have every right to be here." Sheriff Ellis, seated near the front, hid what might have been a smile behind his hand. Whitcomb recovered quickly. "Your presence, Miss Collins, only underscores the issue at hand. Proper young ladies do not associate with women of your reputation." "My reputation?" Martha's laugh held no humor. "Created by this town based on what, exactly? The fact that I arrived alone? That I refused the generous offers of certain married men in this very room?" Her eyes swept the council table, causing several men to look away. "This isn't about Miss Collins," Elijah spoke for the first time, his deep voice commanding attention despite its measured tone. "This is about whether I'm fit to raise my daughter. I've broken no laws. I've paid my taxes. I've built a productive ranch that contributes to this county's economy." Whitcomb scoffed. "This isn't about laws, Freeman. It's about what's best for the child." "What's best for my child is to remain with her father," Elijah responded evenly. "The only parent she's known since her mother died birthing her. A child, especially a girl, needs proper female guidance," Whitcomb insisted. "We're merely suggesting that the territorial authorities evaluate the situation. And if they decide to remove her, place her with a suitable family?" Elijah's careful control slipped slightly. "We all know what that would mean." An uncomfortable silence fell. Everyone understood the implication. Grace would be placed with a white family, raised to forget her heritage, perhaps even her father. Martha moved to stand near Elijah, though still maintaining a proper distance. "I've seen how Mr. Freeman raises his daughter," she said. "She's well-mannered, intelligent, and kind, more genuinely kind than most of the children raised in this town." "With all due respect, Miss Collins," Mayor Wilson said delicately, "your endorsement isn't likely to sway the council in Mr. Freeman's favor." "Then perhaps mine will," came a new voice. Sheriff Ellis stood, adjusting his badge. I've interacted with Grace Freeman monthly for the past 4 years. I've observed her behavior and her father's care firsthand. There is no cause for concern or outside intervention. Whitcomb's face flushed with anger. You're overstepping your authority, Sheriff. No, I'm exercising it. Ellis's weathered face hardened. As the county's law enforcement representative, my assessment of a child's welfare carries significant weight with territorial authorities, and I see no evidence of neglect or improper upbringing. A tense silence followed as the council members exchanged glances. Elijah watched carefully, reading the shifting currents of power in the room. Whitcomb clearly hadn't expected opposition from the sheriff. Mayor Wilson cleared his throat. Perhaps we're being hasty. Mr. Freeman has indeed been a peaceful presence in our community. He shouldn't be raising that girl alone, Whitcomb insisted, but with less conviction. Martha stepped forward again. Then I'll help him. The room erupted in shocked exclamations. Elijah himself looked at her with disbelief. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Collins? The mayor asked when order was restored. I'm offering to provide the female guidance Mr. Whitcomb is so concerned about. Martha's chin lifted. I'll teach Grace what she needs to know about becoming a young lady. You? Whitcomb sputtered. A woman of your standing? Martha's eyes flashed. Yes, Mr. Whitcomb, a woman who survived her husband's brutality, who escaped when he tried to kill her, who rebuilt her life alone despite this town's judgment. She touched her scar. I've never spoken of this publicly before, but if you wish to question my character, let's discuss how I got this. A shocked silence fell. In 7 years, no one had heard Martha Collins's story from her own lips. Elijah watched her with new understanding. Her isolation, her carefully guarded dignity. He recognized the survival strategies of someone who had also known cruelty. That's quite enough, Miss Collins, Mayor Wilson said, visibly uncomfortable. Your personal history isn't relevant here. Isn't it? You've all created a story about who I am without knowing the truth. Just as you've decided, Mr. Freeman can't raise his daughter properly without evidence. Martha looked around the room. I'm offering to help with Grace's education and upbringing, to visit the Freeman Ranch regularly and teach her what a young lady should know. Elijah found his voice. Miss Collins, I appreciate your offer, but it's not charity, Mr. Freeman, she interrupted. It would be an honor. Your daughter saw me when no one else would. I'd like to repay that kindness. The council members huddled, speaking in urgent whispers. Sheriff Ellis moved closer to Elijah and Martha. It might work, he said quietly. Give them a compromise that saves face. Mayor Wilson finally turned back to address them. The council will accept Miss Collins's proposal on a trial basis. Sheriff Ellis will make monthly welfare checks. If, after 6 months, Grace Freeman's situation is deemed appropriate, the matter will be closed. It wasn't perfect, but it was a victory of sorts. Elijah nodded his acceptance, careful to maintain his dignified demeanor, even as relief washed through him. As the meeting adjourned and people filed out, many casting curious glances at the unlikely alliance, Elijah finally spoke directly to Martha. You didn't need to do that. Yes, she said simply. I did. Outside, under the star-filled Kansas sky, Sheriff Ellis approached them. That was quite a performance, Miss Collins. It wasn't a performance, Sheriff, it was the truth. Ellis nodded slowly. I believe you. He turned to Elijah. Freeman, I'll ride out next week for the first official check. But this arrangement... He hesitated. People will talk. People already talk, Martha said wearily. At least now they'll have something new to discuss. As they parted ways, Martha to her small room behind the milliner's shop, Elijah to retrieve Grace before returning to his ranch. Neither could have predicted how profoundly their lives had just changed, or how a child's simple words of recognition would eventually transform not just their futures, but the attitudes of an entire community. 6 months later, December 1882, snow fell gently outside the Freeman cabin, coating the prairie in pristine white. Inside, warmth radiated from both the crackling fireplace and the scene unfolding around the small table. Hold the needle like this, Grace, Martha demonstrated, guiding the little girl's fingers through the motion of a simple stitch. That's right. Now pull it through. Grace's face scrunched in concentration as she completed the stitch on the sampler they'd been working on for weeks. The cloth displayed a progression of increasingly neat stitches, spelling out her name, along with small decorative flowers. "I did it," she exclaimed, looking up for approval. "Beautifully done," Martha praised, tucking a strand of blonde hair behind her ear. The past 6 months had softened her face, easing the perpetual wariness she'd carried for so long. Elijah watched from his workbench in the corner where he was repairing a harness. These twice-weekly lessons had become the highlight of Grace's life, and though he'd never admit it aloud, a welcome change to his own solitary existence as well. "Papa, look!" Grace held up her work proudly. "That's mighty fine stitching, little bird," he said, setting aside his tools to examine her handiwork. "You're becoming quite the young lady." "Miss Martha says I can make a whole handkerchief next," Grace beamed, "with my initial in the corner, like proper ladies have." "And you'll do wonderfully," Martha assured her, beginning to gather their sewing supplies. Their lesson was ending as twilight approached. Martha never stayed past dark, mindful of propriety despite the unusual arrangement. The sound of hoofbeats outside drew Elijah to the window. "Sheriff's here," he announced, recognizing the familiar figure approaching through the snow. These visits had become routine, Ellis arriving for his official welfare check, staying for coffee, sometimes discussing local matters with Elijah, while Grace proudly showed him her latest accomplishments. What had begun as a begrudging compromise had evolved into something that, while not quite friendship, held a measure of mutual respect. "Right on time," Martha noted, helping Grace put away her sewing box, a birthday gift Elijah had crafted from polished walnut. Sheriff Ellis stamped snow from his boots before entering, bringing a gust of cold air with him. "Evening, Freeman, Miss Collins, Miss Grace." He removed his hat, nodding to each in turn. "Coffee, Sheriff?" Elijah offered, already moving to pour a cup from the pot kept warm at the edge of the fireplace. "Appreciate it." Ellis accepted the steaming mug, warming his hands around it before taking a sip. "Getting colder out there." "Miss Martha is teaching me to sew," Grace announced, never shy around the lawman. "And we're reading Little Women together." "That's so?" Ellis smiled. "Learning lots of fancy things, are you?" "Yes, sir. And Miss Martha says knowing fancy things doesn't make you fancy. It's how you treat people that matters." The adults exchanged glances over the child's head, acknowledging the wisdom in the words. "Today makes 6 months, Sheriff," Elijah said quietly. "The council's deadline." Ellis nodded, setting down his coffee. "That's partly why I'm here. Council meetings tomorrow. I'll be delivering my final assessment." He studied the domestic scene before him. "Unless you've got concerns I should know about." "None," Elijah confirmed. "Everything has been—" Martha hesitated. "More than satisfactory." Something in her tone made Elijah glance her way. These months of regular interaction had created a comfortable familiarity between them, but both remained careful to maintain proper boundaries. "Good." Ellis reached into his coat, withdrawing an official-looking envelope. "Because I've already written my report, and I'd like you both to review it before I submit it." Elijah accepted the envelope with surprise. "You're letting us see it first." "Seems only fair, considering it's your lives being discussed." The sheriff's weathered face remained impassive, but his eyes held a glimmer of something almost like kindness. Martha moved to read over Elijah's shoulder as he unfolded the document, still maintaining a proper distance, but close enough that he caught the faint lavender scent she always carried. The report was concise, detailing Ellis's observations of Grace's well-being, education, and the beneficial influence of Martha's instruction. The final paragraph, however, made both of them pause. "It is the considered opinion of this officer that the arrangement between Mr. Freeman, Miss Collins, and the child Grace has proven not merely adequate, but exemplary. The child displays exceptional character, intelligence, and proper manners, reflecting well on both her father's consistent guidance and Miss Collins's ladylike influence. I recommend not only that the current arrangement continue, but that it be recognized as a model of community cooperation, transcending usual social boundaries for the welfare of a child." Elijah looked up, meeting the sheriff's steady gaze. "This is more than we expected. Ellis shrugged slightly. Just writing what I've observed. Martha's voice was soft with emotion. Thank you, Sheriff. Don't thank me yet, Ellis cautioned. Whitcomb won't like it. He's been gunning for both of you since that town meeting. Man holds grudges like a miser holds gold. But the council agreed to abide by your assessment, Elijah pointed out. They did. Doesn't mean there won't be talk or trouble. Ellis reclaimed his coffee, taking a thoughtful sip, which brings me to my other purpose for visiting today. Grace had retreated to her small bed in the corner, absorbed in a picture book Martha had given her, leaving the adults to their serious conversation. There's a position opening up, Ellis continued. Deputy Sheriff for the eastern section of the county. Includes the Exoduster settlement and this area. Elijah frowned, unsure of the relevance. And I'm recommending you for it. The statement hung in the air, shocking both Elijah and Martha into momentary silence. Me? Elijah finally managed. A black deputy? Why not? You fought in the war, served as a buffalo soldier. You know the territory. Speak Spanish decent enough to deal with the vaqueros from the southern ranches. People respect you, even if they don't say it to your face. People like Whitcomb would never accept it, Martha said quietly. Ellis's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. Whitcomb doesn't make county appointments. Judge Foster does, and Foster cares more about competence than color. Why? Elijah asked bluntly. Why recommend me? The sheriff considered him for a long moment. Because I've watched you navigate a situation that would have broken most men with dignity, restraint, and wisdom. This county could use more of that in its law enforcement. Before Elijah could respond, Grace's voice interrupted from her corner. Papa would be a good sheriff, she announced with a child's certainty. He always says justice doesn't care what you look like, only what you do. Ellis chuckled. Smart girl you've got there, Freeman. She is, Elijah agreed, pride warring with the shock of the sheriff's offer. Martha had gone quiet, her face troubled as she gazed out the window at the falling snow. Think about it, Ellis said, finishing his coffee and rising to leave. No need to decide tonight, but consider what it would mean not just for you but for others like you, for Grace's future. After the sheriff departed, silence fell in the cabin, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft sound of Grace turning pages in her book. You should accept, Martha finally said, her voice barely audible. Elijah studied her profile in the firelight, the delicate curve of her jaw, the scar that no longer seemed like a flaw but simply a part of who she was. It would change things, he said carefully. For all of us. Yes. She turned to face him. It would give you the protection of the law, recognition, respect. And what would it give you? He asked, the question laden with meaning they'd both carefully avoided for months. Martha's eyes met his, unwavering. A future where Grace grows up, seeing that the world can change, that people can be more than what others decide they are. Grace looked up from her book, observing the adults with curious eyes. If Papa becomes a sheriff, will you still come teach me, Miss Martha? Martha's expression softened as she looked at the child. Of course I will, dear heart. Good. Grace nodded with satisfaction, because Papa smiles more when you're here, and you look less sad too. The simple observation, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, brought a flush to Martha's cheeks and caused Elijah to clear his throat awkwardly. It's time I headed back to town, Martha said, gathering her cloak. The snow's getting heavier. Elijah moved to the door. I'll hitch the wagon, can't have you walking in this weather. That's not necessary. It is, he interrupted gently. Storm's coming in fast. As he stepped outside to prepare the wagon, Martha knelt to help Grace prepare for bed. Miss Martha? The little girl asked sleepily. Do you think Papa is handsome? Martha's hands stilled on the buttons of Grace's nightgown. That's not a proper question, Grace. But you are beautiful and Papa is handsome, Grace persisted with impeccable 5-year-old logic, and you both look happy when you're together. Sometimes, Martha said carefully, adults have complicated feelings that are difficult to explain. Like how Papa watches you when you're not looking, or how you always fix your hair special before coming here. Martha bit her lip to hide a smile. You notice a great deal for someone so young. Papa says good observation is a valuable skill. Grace yawned widely. I think you should stay here forever. Then we could all be happy together. Martha pressed a gentle kiss to the child's forehead. The world isn't that simple, dear one. Now sleep well. When Elijah returned, Martha was waiting by the door, her cloak fastened against the cold. Together they stepped out into the swirling snow, making their way to the waiting wagon. She's asleep, Martha told him as he helped her up onto the seat. She said to tell you good night. Elijah nodded, taking his place beside her and gathering the reins. Neither spoke as the wagon began its journey through the deepening snow, the lantern swinging gently from its hook, casting dancing shadows. Finally, as the lights of Cottonwood Springs appeared in the distance, Martha broke the silence. Ellis is right. You should take the position. And what happens then? Elijah asked, his voice low. To our arrangement? Martha stared straight ahead. The council can hardly object to Grace receiving instruction from the deputy sheriff's wife. The wagon jerked slightly as Elijah's hands tightened on the reins. Martha, it's the logical solution, she continued, her voice steady despite the trembling of her hands in her lap. It would secure Grace's future, give her a mother, silence the gossip about both of us. Is that all it would be? A logical solution? He turned to look at her, snow gathering on the brim of his hat. In the lantern light, her blue eyes met his, vulnerable yet determined. No, she whispered. Not for me. The wagon slowed as they approached the edge of town. In moments, they would return to the world of careful distances and unspoken boundaries. I won't ask it of you, Elijah said quietly. You've given up enough already. And if I'm not giving up, but gaining? Martha's question hung between them, fragile as a snowflake. Before he could respond, she continued, Grace said something tonight. She said we both look happy when we're together. A small smile curved her lips. Children see what adults often can't or won't. Elijah guided the wagon to a stop, far enough from town to avoid prying eyes. There would be consequences for both of us. There are always consequences for defying expectations, Martha said softly. The question is whether what's gained is worth the cost. Snow continued to fall around them, muffling the world, creating a moment suspended outside the rules that had governed their lives. Papa, she's beautiful. Grace's words from that fateful day echoed between them, the innocent observation that had changed everything. Slowly, deliberately, Elijah reached across the space between them, taking Martha's gloved hand in his. Not as a gesture of assistance or courtesy, but as a man touches a woman he respects, admires, perhaps even loves. Yes, he said simply, she is. In the falling snow, with the lights of Cottonwood Springs glimmering in the distance like stars come to earth, two outcasts chose to rewrite the rules of their world, inspired by the wisdom of a child who had seen only beauty where others saw boundaries. What a journey we've shared together, from a little girl's innocent words to a moment that changed everything. This is the power of seeing beyond society's boundaries. If this story touched your heart, don't keep it to yourself. Share it now with someone who needs a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply seeing the humanity in others. The Black Rancher is dedicated to uncovering these hidden moments in American history, the courage, love, and dignity that shaped our nation in ways history books often overlook. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And leave a comment sharing what moment in this tale resonated most with you. Thank you for riding with me today. Until our trails cross again, remember that the most powerful vision is often through the eyes of a child.